the insidiousness tenet. Because guess what? Critical race theory is insidious. All right, this is going to be a two-part special, and it's something that I just want to cheer from the rooftops that I ran across this because it's a magnificent piece. So this came up because I ran across in my feed here the macro-subjectivity of microaggression studies. It's a Real Clear Investigations piece from July 15th, and it caught my attention actually when I read through it. But I, being the nerdy person that I am, went into the article that's actually cited in here. But I just want to read the opening here real quick. Ever since the most blatant forms of racism and discrimination in America have faded, what are called microaggressions have, in the view of leftist academics and social justice activists, taken their place. These are a form of racism that's the slights and insults that, though subtle and small and typically unconscious, are insulting and harmful to their targets. As noted by Edward Cantu and Lee Jusum, respectively, a law professor at the University of Missouri and a professor of social psychology at Rutgers, microaggressions are a hot topic as universities, diversity trainers, and others are operationalizing the microaggression idea as if it were the product of rigorous science. But in an exhaustive analysis of research supporting the current microaggression construct, or CMC, Cantu and Jusum find that a microaggression is basically what a microaggression researcher subjectively believes it to be, with almost nothing in the way of scientific evidence that racism is embedded in it, or that its alleged victims are even see it as racist or harmful. So I, being me, of course, went into the article in full, which this is it here, and of course it will be linked in the description for you. It's a fairly new piece, although written in April. I mean, it was recently uncovered here, so some folks may have seen it already, but it came across my radar, and I was thrilled in seeing this, and as I got into reading it, I was even more thrilled with it, because one of the things that I think needs to happen with regards to a lot of the things that we see that I think are really corrosive to science, not to mention just to the broader society, is dealing with the issue of pushing back. And that doesn't mean just pushing back in the public sphere, though that's incredibly important. I also think it's incredibly important for the academics, because a lot of the stuff that we're seeing came out of academia to push back hard and forcefully and recognize a lot of the issues. So this is part one of a two-part video, because this very long review article, it's almost 50 pages, deserves a decent amount of time, so I'm going to break this in half. And with that, let's get to the actual article itself. I'm going to try and skim through this as quickly as I can to hit the hot points for you, because I know most of you all don't have time to read a 50-page article, and neither do I. Though I did read through this already before getting started. So, as a law professor, one of us was recently required by his or her his institution to complete an unconscious bias and microaggressions training program. Among the training handouts was a list of statements and questions that apparently constitute microaggressions. The form asked whether the reader had ever done any of the following. Quote, made a statement, I don't see color. Made this statement, I should say. I have complained that someone or something is too PC, or I have asked a person of color to explain something about their culture. According to some psychologists, an affirmative answer of any of these items amounted to an admission of having expressed at least unconscious racism. Okay, so microaggressions are increasingly the focus of social justice discourse, legal scholarship, and administrative programming. Microaggressions are increasingly the basis for all this kind of stuff. At Emory University, students have formally demanded that student evaluation forms include fields wherein students can report microaggressions committed by professors. This is horrifying, because it's not easy to teach. I did teaching for a little bit myself. It is not easy to teach, and anything that you say at this point, anything that you could say to upset a student could be labeled a microaggression and what have you. So that's a bad idea, and I'm glad that they're calling it out here. What is the basis for labeling any of the preceding items microaggressions? How do researchers even know what acts count as microaggressions? Many would assume, that the social scientists who study and publish scholarship on the phenomena have already answered these questions to a degree that makes the current microaggression construct valid. But have they? This is a very fair question to ask, and it's something that if you're pushing on them, pushing on people who are pushing the microaggressions, interesting phrasing, this is something you can push back with them on and just say, you know what, show me the studies, and be able to critique the studies. I actually very much encourage people to get in there and ask and demand that they show their sources and be able to critique their sources. They should be able to produce it for you. They should be able to show it to you. And we'll get into some of that in a minute. By current microaggression construct, here after CMC, we mean the current definition of microaggressions and the set of claims microaggression researchers make about them, the most important of which are claims about what acts count as microaggressions and why. What has happened with microaggressions, educators, scholars, and administrators have accepted the microaggressions as valid, even though psychologists have not established its scientific legitimacy. Yes, this has happened to me too. The institution I work in, one of the things I had to take recently in a diversity training in the last year was a thing on implicit bias and microaggressions. It's there, even though it's not the best thing. Possible reasons for this are manifold. First, academics and research administrators may have a willingness to accept a claim at face value because they deem the concept to be useful ideologically, for example, such that confirmation bias cancels vigilance. This is why you should always have competing viewpoints with different points of view ideologically in an institution, because it can help take care of confirmation bias. More charitably, many people outside the field of psychology simply make the mistake of assuming that peer-reviewed publication of a social science idea means that the idea has been, by definition, thoroughly vetted scientifically. Actually, this is a pretty common mistake a lot of people make, is that when you see new ideas, it's been published and peer-reviewed, it's been vetted. No. Vetting in science means decades. Many decades, repeat testing, repeat analysis. Remember what I said with the guiding principles of scientific inquiry? One of them is replication, and another one that's really important is being open and encouraging debate, scrutiny, and critique of your work, which you're going to see they don't do. In short, it is a mistake to believe that, merely because an idea appears frequently in academic publications, it constitutes scientific fact. Incorrectly, it does not often do that. Often, it is only after withstanding decades of skeptical vetting that a new scientific claim can be established with a reasonable level of certainty. So they're just making a point here. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but they're making a point here that based upon their review of the scholarship in here, nobody should be using the microaggressions nonsense. Generally refrain from relying on the commonly propagated lists of microaggressions as reflecting anything meaningful, at least until psychologists perform a significant amount of empirical work left to be done to render the CMC scientifically valid and useful. So let's get into that a little bit more. So where does it come from? So some people don't know the history, but microaggressions is really tied right alongside the history of critical theory in academia and critical race theory also. The term microaggression was coined by Harvard psychologist Chester Pierce in 1970. He defined the term to mean black-white racial interactions that are characterized by white put-downs done in an automatic, preconscious, or unconscious fashion. And what he said, what Pierce was talking about in this, for those who don't know, is something that was much more explicit and overtly so. So like we're saying we're good to you blacks, which I'm not saying it. I'm just quoting here. YouTube, don't get annoyed. Here, and yeah, that probably is extremely racist. Anyway, in 2007, psychologist Daryl Wing Su brought microaggressions back into the scholarly mainstream. He is the psychologist most credited for the current significantly broadened microaggression construct. He has defined racial microaggressions as, quote, brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentionally or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults toward people. And goes on to say rather about towards people of color, I should say. And he goes on to say in that thing that, yeah, no, this happens all the time. This is not occasional. This is not occasional. This happens all the time. People experience this all the time, which they review here and find that that's not true. Another scholar in here actually describes it on the basis of Pierce's original descriptions and current scholarship as deniable acts of racism that reinforce pathological stereotypes and inequitable scientific social norms. So there's the really explicit things, and there's really explicit phrasing that, yes, could be justifiably so, like saying you're a credit to your race is something they point out here that could be justifiably considered something very racist to say. But the microaggressions idea goes way, way, way beyond that into things that are not, that are really innocuous and really hard to get a handle on, and whether or not they would be so racist. Let's see, the lack of it, yeah, commonly include, and the problems with the microaggressions, we argue, are that psychologists have hereto provided no valid basis for labeling a vast majority of alleged microaggressions as such. 2, that the CMC is nevertheless currently being operationalized as if it were the product of rigorous science. And 3, that the nature of the CMC has the effect of stigmatizing and perhaps silencing those who do not share the ideological assumptions of microaggressions researchers. And this is what we're going to get into a little bit with this, because so the big key here is exactly how they're defining it and whether or not they have actually provided evidence for it. And this is the key thing. And if you're a scientist or science enthusiast, or you value evidence and data and not just lived experiences or anything like that, this is where you can push back on them and ask them to demand it. Demand some evidence from them to say what I'm going to show you next. Demand some evidence when you're accused of a microaggression or presenting with a list of microaggressions that these are actually so. Where's the evidence to prove it? Here. So let's see. Okay. Importantly, rather, researchers argue that listed microaggressive items have intrinsically embedded racist meanings, notwithstanding the non-racist intent of the speaker or the lack of malign interpretation by the recipient. As such, the legitimacy of lists of microaggressions depends on researchers being able to divine objectively racist meaning in facially innocuous acts that others cannot detect. This assumed ability to discern hidden forces and essences in social phenomena is now common in social justice discourse and critical academic theory. This is the key thing, because it is not, what they say in the literature is not the idea that necessarily here you've spoken something that somebody takes offense at, and hence that's a microaggression, or the intent of the speaker. It is simply that the saying itself has something embedded in it that is intrinsically racist. That is the point that they are arguing, that the authors here are pointing out. They're not arguing, the interpretation by the recipient. In fact, they're explicitly ignoring it if the person to whom the supposed microaggression is committed against doesn't think that isn't offended. They don't care about that. It's whether or not the embedded message is offensive. And so this is the point to push back on that. It's your opinion that that's offensive, perhaps. So I don't care what you have to say there. You could push back on it that way for sure, I think. Let's see. Yeah, microaggressions are real and not... so from one of the defenders of this, Monica Williams, a psychologist, microaggressions are real and not simply a subjective experience. Rather, microaggressions are by nature offensive in the sense that they are a form of racism. Where a speaker commits a microaggressive act in certain contexts, those acts are inherently and at least unconsciously racist because they are, by definition, caused by socially conditioned racial biases and prejudices. They function as a form of oppression designed to reinforce the traditional power differentials between groups, whether or not this was conscious intention of the offender. Note to self, for those of you familiar with critical race theory, congratulations, you found it. This is what they're arguing in here is the oppression. These words that are maintaining the dominant structure here. Even if they're not intentionally offended or the person receiving it is not offended. No. They're maintaining power. You can't say those here. So let's see. Consistent with this, Cantor et al. Argue microaggressions are rooted in racist beliefs. Similarly, Sue explains that microaggressions contain both a conscious communication and hidden or meta communication that is outside the level of perpetrator awareness. Blah. So, fair question that the authors of this article then ask: how do researchers know the alleged microaggressions have embedded in them racist messages, whereas the evidence, for example, that racism is the font from which questions such as, "Can I touch your hair?" stem. Such evidence simply does not exist. So this is particularly pertaining to the science side of things, so of course I homed in on this. One such thing that's considered a microaggression is asking the question, a white student asking a black student, for instance, "How did you get so good at science?" That's considered a microaggression under these particular researchers. So things like that. It's really fascinating. Microaggression researchers attribute to the question assumptions about intelligence, competence, or status on the basis of race. In other words, the alleged embedded meaning of the question is roughly, how can a black person be so good at science? That's what they're saying. I'm not saying it, YouTube. The initial response is obvious. It is at least plausible that the speaker simply believes that race aside, her partner is remarkably good at science, and thus that no unconscious stereotype about black people inspired the question. Why should this not be deemed the default embedded meaning rather than a racist meaning? Again, this is something you can push back on with that. There's a lot of trying to change what is the meaning of words in here. To me, that question, how did you get so good at science, is entirely innocuous. And if a gentleman were asking me that question, I wouldn't be thinking it was sexist at all. I also personally wouldn't really care. But anyway, so that's the thing, is it could be, it would depend upon the context. How was that question asked? What was the tone that it was asked with? Was it asked with clear condescension and derision? Or was it asked with wonder and with awe and being amazed at how good a person actually is at it? There's a big difference there. But the question itself is not. And it shouldn't be the default that somebody goes to. We shouldn't be teaching people to find the absolute negative about something, but rather just, hey, she thinks she's really good and she wants to know how the person got so good at it. That I'd consider a compliment, that kind of question phrased that way. So let's see. The question according to the microaggression people, the question in context by nature is inspired by racism, either consciously or unconsciously. Williams rejects the possibility that, quote, certain microaggression items reflect innocuous statements or actions that do not stem from implicit racial biases. Remember the first tenet of critical race theory. Everything is racist. Every interaction between races is tinged with racism. You do not ever get away from it, rather. Researchers provide no meaningful evidence to support the notion that the question, by its nature and in context, stems from racial bias. It is just assumed. That's a critical race theory kind of thing going on there. Just to remember that, if there's that kind of assumption made. But that's the thing, and this is, I think, one way as a general public, but as also a scientist, is one way you can push back against the things going on here. Don't accept the assumption that they're making. Don't acknowledge it. Don't accept that premise as being correct. That just because that question was asked from a white person to a black person, that it was inherently racist. That it's a microaggression. Don't accept that. Don't accept that assumption. Don't buy into it and say, no, I have a different interpretation. I don't think it was racist at all. Ask, it might be an awkward conversation, but you could ask the person who was asked that question, is it offensive? And if we're crying out loud, that's the thing. One thing you can do, push back on that. Again, I'm very happy to see the authors of this pointing this out as succinctly as they did. And, well, not succinctly, 50 pages in here, but things like that, I think, are one good way to think of fighting back here. Push back and make sure people know that, no, that's your opinion that's a microaggression. I don't think it is, and it's totally fair to push back on that. You may not want to in the moment, and it may not be the best thing to do in the moment, so you got to judge that based upon where you are and what's going on. But I would question, what really is that or isn't it? Because I don't think it is. Researchers seem to simply assume the respective embedded meanings and therefore declare statements and questions to be microaggressions simply by fiat. So let's see. So they go on here to actually talk about one of the methods that was used, and it's sort of a focus group approach, as the way Sue did it in this original 2007 article, which brought back and broadened the whole idea of there being such a thing as microaggressions are real. So, under the method, persons of color study participants are placed in small discussion groups to discuss microaggressions they believe they suffered. Of course, this methodology simply makes the study participants' intuition controlling rather than the researchers, but the problem remains. The subject's self-reporting is clearly insufficient for showing that listed microaggression items have objectively embedded in them racist messages. It merely demonstrates that some people of color suspect that subtle racism is at play when hearing the listed microaggressions. Williams has responded to the calls for greater evidence of embedded racist meanings with invocation of her lived experience. So, And yeah, and that's one where it gets back in there. How dare you reject my lived experience kind of thing. The problem with this methodology should be obvious. How do we know the respondents are correct? How do we know that the respondent's perception of the statement is the objective correct way as they've described it? Remember, they've described microaggressions here as being embedded with a racist context, embedded with a racist message, even if the speaker didn't intend it and the person to whom it was spoken or acted upon isn't maligned by it. They're not offended. It's just there anyway, even if somebody's not offended. So how do you know if the respondent saying that something is offensive is actually embedded with a racist meaning then? Because it's not about how the speaker receives it. Think about it. How the person receives it. Think about that. Let's see. There's a couple of different things in here. I don't want to dwell on this too much because I know I'm already at 20 minutes. Does this behavior... Yeah. So there's a few things in here, and I encourage you to go in and read this because if you have the time and you can parse through it, and actually it wasn't too difficult to read for me, and I'm actually not a psychologist or a lawyer by trade, so this this was actually fairly easy to read, though it was certainly lengthy. And they do take apart a huge amount of things here. So one of the things to note here is what they're talking about is, does the behavior, how they consider microaggressions in the people that support it, microaggressions, answering two questions. Does the behavior reinforce a stereotype or promote exclusion? And is it easy to explain away as having been due to race? So if the answer to both is yes, that's how they determine a microaggression. That's what they say. But the problem with this is that on the one hand, this is just about the behavior, and this is just about the state of mind on the part of the speaker. That's actually pretty contradiction. So what he's asking as a note here, critiquing this notion and how they ask questions of microaggressions, is it the effects of the act or the state of mind of the person speaking it that makes the act a microaggression? They can't clearly answer that. So that's a point to remember. Let's see. Obnoxious to some. How do you know? The statement may be obnoxious, all lives matter, but how do you know that this particular statement reinforces pathological stereotypes? The thing is, it's conceivable, but the people who push this actually don't provide a meaningful answer, is what they're making a point on here. But often go back to say, oh, well, you need to go do the work. Oh, you should go find out. Oh, you should educate yourself. No. If you're making the assertion, you're the one who needs to defend it and prove it. So in other words, leaving it out and simply believing, implying that other psychologists should just believe her because she's a diversity expert when it comes to microaggressions. So this is actually quite an interesting rip apart of that whole thing. And the other problem they point out with the kind of definition of microaggressions is that, interestingly, there's a sort of contradiction that goes on, I guess is the best way to prove it. That's not the right word, but I'm struggling for words as I've been working most of today writing. But a vast majority of statements, let's see, prong number 2 suggests that the more an act can possibly be motivated by a non-racial factor, the more it qualifies as a microaggression. Basically, it's to say is, if a statement that you make has 99 different ways that it could be not motivated by a racial factor, but one way that it does, that makes it more likely to be a microaggression than one that has 50 ways of being motivated by non-racial factors and 50 ways of being motivated by non-racial factors. So the smaller the likelihood that it was motivated by a racial factor, the more likely it is as a microaggression. It's an inverse relationship in the way they describe it. Doesn't that seem strange to you? So I'm glad they point this out. I'm trying so hard to break this down because there's a lot of strange legalese here. And that's the one big thing here. So if you were to read anything of this article yourself, I do suggest reading up to this point on page 14, because there's a lot of great things that get broken down in here. And there's another section I'll read here. So I'm going to skip through the method section. But what they're highlighting in these two sections is the big flaws of a lot of the research papers. And I can summarize that really quickly. Super small samples that are highly selective, and they often focus on students at universities and often students who have gone through diversity trainings. selective, so very selective samples and not necessarily representative of the rest of the population that doesn't live in academia and hasn't been exposed to huge numbers of diversity trainings. Ignoring significant numbers of Black people in their respondent surveys who disagree. So they have an example in here where it was, I think it was 47% of respondents said, no, this isn't racist at all. But the other 53% said yes. First off, what's the error bounds on that? Second thing is, what the hell? That's almost half of the people say this is not a problem. I'm not offended by this. I don't think this is racist. Why did you say that? So why do you ignore that? But they get ignored. Lack of definition. So they often ask people to rank on, slightly racist, somewhat racist, what have you. But what is slightly racist? There's no common definition that's given. And that's a problem because then you're relying on individual subjective threshold. They often use the correlation equal causation fallacy in here. So the two things are correlated, therefore one causes the other. That's not necessarily true. The lack of connection between the expression and the idea of somebody being racist or having negative attitudes towards somebody of a different race. Yeah, they have lack of this. Most studies have no statistical significance from what I could read in here, and no statistical significance, or it's very small. And I mean something in the neighborhood of 0.3, which is very small, actually, 0.3 to 0.4, something along that line. It's in here, the exact number, but it's in about that ballpark. And the other thing is they often do mismatched expressions. And what I mean by that is when they're doing these things, they'll put in expressions in these studies. They'll put in expressions, according to this, that are clearly very racist. And put them in with things that are more innocuous, and that will make it that will kind of sort of bias the results toward being more expressive of racism and saying these things are rooted in racism. But you put in a whole bunch of statements that are clearly rooted in racism and put in a whole bunch of statements that are not. You didn't look at them separately. So those are the big things in here that I wanted to mention just to summarize the methodology, because it is a long methods section that they go into in this very long paper. Okay. Something I did want to mention here is one of the things they're concerned about is the idea of idea laundering, which is a flaw, I think, in peer review, in that if people are not carefully reviewing an article and being extremely skeptical, it can get things in through publication that are not very valid and lack a lot of rigor, and bring in things that actually have no credence at all, but they get in as a peer-reviewed article, and then the problem is they end up being cited by new researchers and further cited and what have you. So I'm actually really critical when I do peer review of, did you check the assumptions this guy made in his prior article? And that's the reason why, is because a lot of things can get by in peer review just because we're really busy people. And we do peer review on the side without ever getting paid any extra for it. So it's an additional thing we have to do. Okay. So yeah, what is needed in a lot of the situations with the microaggression stuff, and I will extend it to a lot of the things with critical theory and critical race theory in the left, severe testing. Find flaws in the claim and looking at alternative explanations and what have you. Remember, a lot of critical theory and critical race theory can't stand divergent explanations or different explanations that might be different from their premise. But they need it. And as scientists, if you are a scientist and you're being forced to go through this stuff, demand it. Demand that they look at alternative explanations. You have that power to demand that. Exercise it. If microaggressions are really as pervasive as claimed, then yes. So if you got to keep repeating and replicating and what have you. Let's see. Regularly claim that persons of color face an onslaught of microaggressions with high frequency. Psychologist Kevin Nadal sought to measure the microaggressions that people of color experience in their everyday lives. Let's see. Yeah, what he's making a point here, I won't dwell on it for you, but I encourage you to go read the article, which is linked in the description. A vast majority of the items, so he is actually pointing out here that most of the people who responded in this particular psychologist survey results said, yeah, I only had that happen to me like 1 to 3 times in the last 6 months, if at all. So it's not really the idea of microaggressions is not really the all-encompassing social ailment that they push it to be, which is to say racism is not as rampant as they think it is. Rather, one could fairly suspect that microaggressions represents an activism of a sort, wherein the problem, widespread subtle racism, is assumed, and that reinforcement of an activist narrative is the preordained conclusion. So they're actually getting into this, and I will say the second section, I'm going to try and get through this quickly, but it comes and cuts into a lot of the important things about critical race theory that is important, and they actually specifically state in here that critical race theory has entire control and influence in a lot of the microaggressions research, and particularly those who are defenders of it. The microaggressions construct is sweeping through the social justice zeitgeist, precisely because it claims to be so much more than a warning to not say facially offensive things or an admonition to whites to think about how they might be misinterpreted by people of color before speaking and to empathize accordingly. Rather, Sue and others, using powerful, sweeping, and often unqualified language, claim to have revealed something hereto hidden from view. As Sue has put it, his research seeks to make the invisible visible. Such revelations are taken as groundbreaking and important because they are consistent with critical race theory, which is popular in the academic and activist communities today. A central thesis of critical race theory is what might be termed the insidiousness tenet, which is a priori belief that the subtle contours of culture, especially those created by language, are saturated with hidden racism. Alright, first thing I gotta say this, I love that they called it the insidiousness tenet. I love it, the insidiousness tenet. Because guess what? Critical race theory is insidious. Let's see. So, yeah, and he's going through a little bit of the history here with this. In the 1970s, social scientists were at that point trying to figure out hidden, camouflaged, or unconscious forms of racism when they're asking, inequality persisting in society, and it does still persist, that's fair. The influence of critical race theory and microaggression research is obvious, and it is often advertised. They don't hide it. Research on microaggressions is invaluable to critical race narrative because, given the influence of critical race theory on microaggression research, the insidiousness tenet is so often embedded in that research. Rather, they regularly claim that the subtle racism of today is the product of old-fashioned overt racism transformed itself into subtle forms. They cannot say that racism is decreased. Let's put it that way. They can't live with the fact that racism has been decreased. Let's see. Microaggression research provides a veneer of scientific credibility to vested critical premises, as those studies have statistics, p-values, and reliability coefficients, all useful for creating the appearance of scientific foundations for assumptions, so long as one does not examine the methodological details of the studies too closely. And this is a key point that I want to make here, is this is why I harp on what the hell the methods of the study are, because if the methods are not suited to answering the question, you can put out a crap study that you didn't mean to, and other people then go cite it and what have you. But the other thing is that kind of thing of using faulty methods and sort of tricking people, I hate to say it, but it's the right way to say it here, tricking people into thinking that because it's science, it's great. People have a trust to the experts. People have a trust to the scientists. And the scientists who are using that need to make sure they are being fucking responsible with it. Using it and tricking people into believing something because you have a veneer of credibility, because look at this, it's published over here, look at this, it's analysis that shows this, because you know that some people who don't have the background or are intimidated by science or by scientific experts won't go in and examine it and may just take you at face value. The scientists who are doing that knowingly, they're the ones that piss me off to no end. And my encouragement to you all in the public who are reading this, question the methods. Ask them to explain it. Tell them to explain it to you simply. Challenge them on it. Do it. I guarantee you will have my backing all the time. And if you need my help to interpret a study, I'm there. Leave a note on this channel. I will help you with it. Either that or message me on Twitter. I can help you with that there too. Let's see. Yeah, what they're getting into with this is the idea that disagreement is bad, actually, in here. Is most of what this section is about is the point that they don't like disagreement and they try to silence disagreement. On this score, it is apparent that much of microaggression research is driven by what appears to be a form of methodological activism, the ultimate design of which is to advance a critical race theory narrative of social reality. A primary feature of this methodological activism is the perception of the scientific method as illegitimately constraining on other ways of knowing by traditionally marginalized people. Researchers invoke experiential reality of some people of color as being somehow scientifically authoritative, or they reject calls for greater empirical support with the charge that such demands represent an epistemological imperialism by critics seeking to, as white males, hold on to their power to define reality. Well, let me tell you what, for one thing, I'm a woman and I'm demanding more evidence, more empirical data and support here for this. Sorry, doesn't apply to me. They're to call me a white man. Yes, I'm white, but geez, I'm criminy. That doesn't matter here. I still want your evidence in here. And that's a point to make. That is not a valid critique according to the ideas and principles of organized skepticism and the call for fair critique and what here. That's an ad hominem. That is not good science. So, and you know what? Call them out on that. If I'm saying that, if you're a scientist and you're dealing with this shit, call them out on that. Call them out that they're doing ad hominems, because that's what that amounts to, is just saying, well, no, you're rejecting somebody's experiences. No, that's an ad hominem attack. I'm asking you for more information. And that doesn't make me racist. I want more information. I want to see the data. I want to see you prove it. He criticized his critic for this has to do with how this whole section here has to do with how critics are responding, how they respond, I should say, to critics of the whole idea of microaggressions, and this generally applies to a lot of people with critical race theory. He criticized his critic for applying the accepted scientific principle of skepticism to the study of microaggressions, which may unintentionally dilute, dismiss, and negate the lived experience of marginalized groups in our society. In other words, Sue responded to the normal scientific skepticism of his detractors with an implicit argument made in the unmistakable spirit of postmodernism, which significantly influences critical race theory, that the application of scientific rigor was an attempt at defining reality and therefore a power play. Again, that's an ad hominem, that's not an answer. And there's actually a lot in here. So one of the psychologists who pushed back really strongly against microaggressions research is Scott Lilienfeld here, and he had a lot in here, and so the authors go into the back and forth between Monica Williams and Scott Lilienfeld on here, and I have to go read both of these papers myself because I'm really curious about what the back and forth was, but it's interesting because apparently Lilienfeld was actually pretty restrained about it, and it was the other author who kept saying, "Well, no, you're preventing people of color and all this, and you're going off." She goes off with all these ad hominems, is what it is, and that's something to just keep in mind here, that's going to happen. So let's see. A scientist must address good faith criticism of their work on the merits, not simply by deflection with ad hominem impugnment of the integrity or decency of the critic. And that's a point to make here. Critical race theorists don't like to do that. Critical theorists don't like to do that, and the microaggression stuff falls into that category. So I will venture as far to say, if you're getting microaggressions in a diversity training or something like that, you're probably being fed critical race theory at this point. Just saying. Rather in the background and often in the foreground, the disagreement over one over what counts as the legitimate production of knowledge. Concerning to us is this: if researchers take the view that disagreement about the legitimacy of the microaggressions construct is a struggle between oppressors and oppressed over the power to define reality, how do proponents of the microaggressions exercise this power once they obtain it? That is actually a really profound and terrifying question, if you think about it carefully. For the folks who have, when they get the power to define reality, how are they going to exercise it? I'm not going to go off on a glorious mindfuck with that right now, but think really carefully on that question, because if you're on the fence with the woke stuff and the critical race theory nonsense, think about the fact that you might be giving them some kind of power to define what language you can use. what your reality is. Getting into the Orwell territory very quickly with that. Think about it carefully. How will they exercise that power when they obtain it? The final thing here that I just want to talk about in this section is that there is a lot of concern with this over the silencing of dissent here. And one of the examples they cited was the earlier thing of just like the arguing back and forth, and professional challenges to the work are being met with charges of racism and accusation of committing microaggressions by raising objections and all those other kinds of things. But there are other examples here that they go through. One of them is the idea that the phrase microaggression itself, aggression is a powerful term. It's got a connotation of hostility, intentionality, and less direct, but oppression and domination too is what they talk about right here. And so that's the point they're making with this, is that, labeling somebody with that, it's a tactical sort of creep with that term, in that you are labeling somebody as being aggressive. You're labeling them as being mean and aggressive. They committed a microaggression. They're a mean person. They're a nasty person. And most people get turned off by that. So it is a way to silence somebody, to say, you don't want to be morally wrong, right? So bear in mind that that's going to be a label that's thrown at you subtly. It's not as overt as saying, well, you're a racist. It's a very subtle thing that they're pointing out here. And I'm so glad that these researchers are speaking up and saying this in this article, with plenty of examples here. They go in to talk about Jonathan Haidt here and all of that. Let's see. Okay. The entire subcategory of microaggressions is devoted to tarring and feathering as unconscious racists those who subscribe to the ethic of colorblindness. Some may reasonably, even if incorrectly, believe that achieving social justice does not require the relatively high emphasis on identity and difference that characterizes the current fashionable critical worldviews of academics and activists. Not me, by the way. But reasonable disagreement is made unreasonable when trusted academics, intentionally or not, construct a device that virtually begs for weaponization against those with more conservative, moderate, or liberal, as opposed to critical or radical worldviews. So that's a great point to make in here. It's just like, nope. If you're constructing it in a way that, you're asking for weaponization, it's a problem. So in short, patterns in the microaggressions construct, as well as in the researchers' accusations toward one another, make the enterprise resemble a system designed to insulate itself from healthy challenge and to stigmatize and silence interlocutors. The implications of an idea bear on its legitimacy. This, combined with the scientific weaknesses of the microaggressions construct, suggests that the microaggressions construct is little more than a mechanism to vindicate the intuitive hunches of those who see racism as more pervasive than others do, and to silence those worldviews that are premised on different hunches. Now, I'm actually going to stop here because I want to do a whole video just on this third section. Because I may just read a whole chunk of it, because it is actually brilliant section here that I really want to get into. And so that last point is the critical one. There's a lot of attempted silencing. So it's my recommendation here. And again, if I were making a recommended reading list for students and what have you, I would put this on there, given the number of diversity things that have been going on now. This video has run a little bit longer than I would have hoped, but it's still, I hope, useful for all of you. I'm going to record another video tomorrow on the second half of this. And that's the point I want to make here. There's a lot of really interesting and juicy things. And actually, there was one thing I was trying to find, and I missed it up here somewhere in one of the other sections where there was the argument over differences and things like that. Oh, yeah, here it is. Importantly, we highlight exchanges such as these not in a tawdry fashion, that is, not with a design to highlight interesting but unimportant interpersonal drama for its spectacle value. Rather, the point is to demonstrate a more pernicious manifestation of methodological activism, one that should further undermine the faith in much of microaggression research. An aggressive fragility combined with an assumed but unjustified moral and epistemic authority that serves together to stigmatize challengers to the current microaggression construct as either racist or racially insensitive. Examples of this strike us as power plays. We fear this strongly disincentivize good faith, scientifically sound critiques of claims by microaggression researchers. It is therefore profoundly anti-scientific. Scientists must address good faith criticism of their work on the merits, not simply by deflection with ad hominem impugnment of the integrity or decency of the critic. I wholeheartedly agree. And this is the thing, is if you're going to be running into an aggressively let's just put it this way. If you're going to run into somebody with a case of aggressive fragility, who is very woke aggressive fragility, there we go. If you run into somebody with a case of woke aggressive fragility, don't be afraid to push back. Keep on pushing back on them. Don't let them, they're going to call you racist, they're going to call you all sorts of names in the book. Push back on them. Gently, politely. Don't take the bait and get super aggressive with them, because that'll just confirm it in their heads. But push back on them, because this is utterly unscientific, the phrasing of microaggressions. And I will say, of critical theory and critical race theory as a whole, it's actually very thing here. I would call them all, the woke folks have aggressive fragility when their things are challenged. They don't like it. Ooh, we could construct the same Kafka trap as Robin DiAngelo. Anyway, I very much encourage you to go read this. I am thrilled that a whole collection, that this lawyer and this psychologist both came out and said no to this nonsense, and are finally coming out to say something. I think it's, that's why I wanted to highlight it here. So I will release another video on this particular article soon, but I encourage you to go read it to get into it, and feel free to comment, chat below if there's anything interesting you found out of it. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel. You can also find me on sciworthy.locals.com. If you become a supporter there, you can interact more with me directly. Share this video, like this video, subscribe to this video. Thank you very much. That's the first video, part 1 here, very long, but I look forward to hearing your comments. Until next time, I'm Adrian, signing off. Stay curious, my friends.